52. 18th century pre-revolutionary tea. You are invited to have a dish with me. Hello, and welcome to the history of American food. This week, I'll be looking at the role tea played in the 18th century colonies, how it got tangled up in the politics of the day, just who was drinking tea, and what kind of teas people were drinking at the time. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that the teacup of today was unknown in the 18th century. And what's more, there wasn't a mug in sight. It was all handleless out there, and tea was too refined for a substantial beaker, or the type of person who would be quaffing their thirst from such an object. Well, mostly. Let me set the mood. To quote Rodris Roth, in tea drinking in the 18th century, it's etiquette and equipage. Quote, in 18th century America, the pleasant practice of taking tea at home was an established social custom with a recognized code of manners and distinctive furnishings. Unquote. In the 17th century, Europe and then the North American colonies were still figuring out what to make of tea. It had been viewed as much a medicine as a beverage. Its rarity and expense and origins from the mysterious East all gave it credence as a curative. However, by the 18th century, it had moved into fashionable circles. While certainly good for those in the sick room, it was in no way reserved for it. In Europe, tea houses and tea gardens were opening up, but in the colonies, where there still wasn't much in the way of cities, private homes were the main venue for tea drinking. Taverns and ordinaries certainly served the public, but these were mainly male establishments and had no designs on ceremony and genteel display. So no contemporary public tea culture grew up in the colonies. From the start of the century, tea was both a morning and an afternoon drink among those who could afford it. The main difference being that morning tea was a private or family affair, while in the afternoon it was often an event of social consequence. While breakfast beer would remain amongst much of the colonial population, breakfast tea started to make inroads amongst even the middling sort of the population, as long as they were anywhere near a port with lively trade and a decent road part of the year. By mid-century, the Pennsylvania communities that spoke little or no English, having not sprung from Britannia, the Swedes, the Germans, and other communities were seen to be incorporating tea into their morning routines, and even in places where tea was not for daily use, it might be kept to bring out for visitors along with coffee and drinking chocolate and muscovado sugar. As the century entered its second half, a bustling, prosperous port city like Philadelphia, up to a third of the population might consume tea twice a day. Clearly, there was a large chunk of the population that once they had experienced a caffeine-tinged morning, had little desire to return to that beery breakfast. But it was more than that. Tea was the kale or the kombucha of its day. Yes, it had some benefits, but many of them were as much about taking part in what was the thing of the day, so its social and image impact far outstripped its actual benefits. It's just what one did to show that they were participating in the present best thing. So how did one brew and drink tea in the 18th century? First of all, one acquired a water boiler, the teapot we think of, where you heat the water, a tea caddy in which to store the tea, a caddy spoon for measuring out the tea, a teapot for brewing, and a creamer, a sugar bowl, sugar tongs, and of course the dishes for consuming the refined beverage. Spoons for stirring or managing sugar lumps, a slop bowl, and later in the century, a strainer might appear. And to manage and move all this, a tea tray was essential as well. If one was a married lady of means, you might purchase a range of tea accoutrements over the course of your married life. But even for women of more modest means, one of the most desired wedding gifts was a tea set of their own. For one perquisite of the married state was the ability to welcome and serve guests in one's own home, and establish oneself as an individual out from under the wing of parents. The women at this stage were legally considered an appendage of their father or husband. A married woman had much more say in her daily activities than a daughter did, and the chance to host her own friends, make decisions about what foods to serve, what clothing to wear, and a chance to show off all those years of practice were much desired. So the tradition of playing tea party seems to have grown out of little girls wanting, first of all, to be grown up enough to join adult tea time with all the good cakes and biscuits, and then later to grasp at the independence and, frankly, social power hosting tea time meant. Tea and tea service largely arrived together in the colonies and would evolve dramatically over the course of the century. At this time, tea was exclusively Chinese. No commercial plantations outside its borders existed. First to grace tables were just teapots and tea bowls. There would be a stand for the hot water boiler and sometimes saucers for the tea bowls. As European tea traditions grew, Chinese and then Japanese porcelain sets made in export styles would start to populate colonial tables. Delft ware from the workshops and kilns of Holland filtered south from the Dutch trade that continued with New York out of Europe, as well as goods brought with other Caribbean trade items like lemons, molasses, and sugar from the Dutch outposts in Brazil and Curacao. East Asian tea steeping is an art, and there are myriad rules and traditions about water temperature, water-to-leaf ratios, and steeping times. And most of all, the tea is to be drunk plain, with nothing added. Europeans and especially North American colonists neither knew of these subtleties and were boiling and often letting their tea steep for too long, as well as often not using enough leaves. To compound the problem, they were often dealing with teas that might be adulterated and could be tainted with molds. And the class of people drinking the tea by the 18th century had a collective, wild, out-of-control sweet tooth. As a result, adding sugar and later milk or cream to tea became a very common practice, especially in afternoon tea, where all these extra steps added to the ceremony and gave those in the know that many more steps to torture social newbies with. As the European style of tea drinking developed, the tea tray and tea table were soon crowded with sugar bowls and tongs, creamers and spoons, not to mention the ever-expanding population of stands, bowls, and trays to accommodate them. The one thing that didn't change for most of the century was that tea was served in bowls. Before large elaborate tea sets were common, women as part of their visiting kit would bring their own tea bowls, saucers, and spoons. I'm certain a bit of social posturing was done then, which teacup to bring to which party, to show up or show down as necessary. As for the tea brewing parts, it was common for all the parts of the tea service to coordinate rather than to match. Later on, as more export porcelain arrived, the tea serving bowls and saucers and possibly the teapot might come as a set. But all the other bits and bobs were either commissioned to coordinate or carefully sought. A silver teapot, usually made out of plundered Spanish silver at a closer or further remove, might be commissioned, and then a coordinating sugar, and as dairy production expanded in the colonies, a creamer might also be acquired over time. Examples of these items in glass, pewter, as well as porcelain exist. Early in tea's existence, it was more common to acquire tea equipage over time and create an arrangement that gave off the most power vibes in any given situation. But by the end of the century, it was all the rage to simply purchase new tea sets as the newest style took off in tea furniture. The precise manner of brewing tea was always up for debate, but generally, water was boiled in a metal kettle that was brought to the table and placed on a stand. This was hot and had to be handled carefully. Later, elaborate water pouring systems would develop. Anyway, every movement was ceremony. The English citizens and colonists might not know about the Japanese tea ceremonies at this point, but they instinctively understood how the nature of the beverage positively invited theater. Tea would be measured from a tea caddy or storage container. These were porcelain in fashionable locations, though might be wood in less wealthy homes. A special caddy spoon and specially shaped caddy lids could also be used to measure the tea. The loose leaves would be placed in the brewing pot, that's the pretty one, and hot water added. When the strength was judged proper, tea would be poured into guests' cups, tea leaves and all. Then sugar and, in later days, cream or milk were offered, added, and stirred in. I'm not here to talk about milk first or not. That's definitely a 19th century problem, so please just sit you down. Because tea and sugar were approximately equal wealth displays in this age, sometimes the practice was to hold a small lump of sugar in the teeth and drink the tea through it. Also at this time, the practice was to consume the tea warm rather than hot, as consuming beverages that were too heated, as well as too cold, were regarded as dangerous with regards to setting one's humors out of balance. What they would have made of iced tea, I can't imagine. At afternoon tea, reaching the acceptable temperature was accomplished by simply serving tea in tiny little cups and discussing polite nothings while it cooled down. However, in the morning, where there might be haste involved, or among less rarefied company, breakfast tea might be tipped into the saucer to cool more quickly and drunk from there. In cartoons and illustrations of spinsters, widows, and rustics, they are shown sipping tea out of their saucers. Looking at the late 19th and 20th century saucers, this might seem ridiculous. But the saucers of the mid to late 18th century were much more akin to a shallow bowl, what you might use to give one's cat the popular storybook object of a saucer of milk. British colonials seemed more willing to drink their tea at a higher temperature. More than one diarist commented on their propensity to drink their tea quite hot. Also for fun, the novel practice of holding slices of bread over the coals until crisp and then making it quite soaked with butter was also remarked upon. While tea and cake, tea and scones, tea and sweet biscuits, and tea and small wig cakes, and even tea and bread all existed at home and in the colonies, tea and toast was at this point a quaint colonial innovation. The dance of rules and conventions created a set of impossible conundrums that could and often were used to send messages of who was in or out socially, and some apocryphal stories were born as well. America was particularly known for thrusting likely young men into the society of their betters. After all, the country was not yet overrun with excess sons of the nobility and aristocracy, and there were ever more positions that needed to be filled. And afternoon tea was a minefield. It was known that rudeness must be avoided at all costs, and one rule seemed to be that refusing a refill of tea counted as rudeness. But then it was also thought that not drinking one's tea might also be seen as rude. How to stop the refills? A nervous young man might find himself awash in tea. In some places, turning a cup upside down in the saucer might be the signal. In others, placing a teaspoon across the top of the cup. Not knowing which was acceptable, or possibly not knowing anything about such signals, it was not unknown for such a befuddled young man to supposedly drop an empty teacup into his coat pocket to stop the onslaught of tea. And then if he couldn't figure out how to discreetly remove it before leaving, an entire stage play of farce could and surely was written about the situation. Of such social niceties were the satires created. And I can't help but add here that even in the earliest paintings from the late 17th and early 18th centuries that show a family or a group drinking tea, the lifted pinky is already in evidence. Instead of grasping the cup by a tiny loop of a handle, the handleless tea bowls were held by the thick rim on the bottom and the lip on the top of the bowl. Picking up the dish of tea by the belly of the bowl in the whole hand was at some point determined to be most gauche, as well as putting the drinker in danger of burning themselves. So how did something that was a medicine too and an ornament for royal and the very highest society in the 17th century make it to being common enough that a third of Philadelphia was drinking it twice a day less than 100 years later, as well as gracing nearly every home to some capacity for at least special occasions? Sure, early in the century, a housewife or cook or scullery maid might have boiled the leaves and served them as a vegetable, salted in with butter, throwing out the water they were boiled in, but this was no longer a problem by the second quarter of the century. So what was the engine that drove the spread of tea in Britain and its colonies? The East India Company. As I've mentioned, in the 17th century and on into the early 18th, Spain had been dumping insane volumes of silver into the European economy. Some by actually getting to Spain and then being spent on war and stuff, but a fair amount was being hijacked by both pirates for their own sake and privateers with letters of marque representing one government or another, and the English were very much in on the game. With all this silver coming in, it didn't seem like that much of a problem to use some of that silver to purchase tea from China. China, being a pretty closed economy with coinage problems of its own, was happy to sell things like silk and tea and porcelain. But they weren't buying, and they only accepted payment in silver. No trading for iron or sugar or wool. This worked pretty well. But to keep the British coffers from simply emptying into China's, the British government tacked taxes onto the tea up to 119%. Tea taxes alone were 10% of annual revenue, so great was this thirst for tea. But with this markup, you can imagine the smuggling of tea was quite the thing. Tea had been coming to North America via New Amsterdam since the last century, to the point where one Dr. de Lang had 136 teapots in his collection. As tea's popularity grew, the British East India Company, the BEIC, became more forceful and more willing to invest in relationships in the Chinese trading cities. In the 17th and 18th centuries, China effectively had closed borders. No one who was Chinese could leave except under special permission, and of even more moment, no one who was not Chinese could come in. At the start, there were special walled cities that were used to control trade with the outside. They were kind of successful, but were porous to a certain extent. But what this really meant was that in the 18th century, most of the tea coming to Europe and North America was courtesy of the VOC, or the Dutch East Indian Company. They got most of their tea from Chinese exports to Batavia. Along with the tea, the Dutch would also consolidate their spice shipments of cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, ginger, galangal, and nutmeg, as well as exotic woods, cloth, and porcelain. But as the Anglo-Dutch Wars handicapped Dutch shipping and the British Navy took advantage of the great timber wealth of their North American colonies, the BEIC began to be the dominant force in the Chinese tea trade. The British began stealing a march on the Dutch by actually going to the Chinese trading cities on the mainland, which meant over time the Batavia tea was of lesser quality because the British were snagging the best stuff at the Chinese ports. Traders were happy to sell tea for profit without having to ship it to Indonesia, a time-consuming operation even when all the weather and pirates cooperated. The BEIC had established tea dominance with China by 1715, shipping over 3 times the amount the VOC moved. The Dutch and other European powers would move to shipping directly from Guangzhou, but British supremacy had been established and they were not going to let this go. More on that in the 19th century when things get really nasty. So the first price drop in tea happened because, as with tobacco, there was simply more available on the market. The second price drop happened because not all of the tea around was accounted for in manifests. With such a high markup due to taxes, the incentive for tea smuggling was incredible. Sure, some tea had to be bought with taxes paid, but if it turned somehow into twice or thrice the amount mysteriously in one's tea caddy, well, since everyone else was in on the game, it was unlikely you would get ratted out. The British did take note of the trend and that the volume of tea about was not matching the tax receipts, but the taxes were so high, tea shippers and merchants were able to pay pretty good bribes and still make a profit considering the extremely high taxes. Finally, the British government let up on the ludicrous taxes in 1783, but not before tea had become one of the final straws in the build-up to war. Details on that will be released next season. Now to move on to the kinds of tea being drunk. These days we more or less sort tea, the Camellia sinensis stuff, into 3 main categories. Black tea, or leaves that have been broken or bruised to allow some of the internal chemicals to oxidize over shorter or longer periods of time, and then fully dried with different regimens of artificial heat. Green tea, which is partially sun-dried and then finished with artificial heat. And finally, white tea, which is the least processed of all, basically just sun-dried and left at that. Each of these types, of course, have sub and sub-sub and sub-sub-sub categories. All things being equal, black teas tend to have the strongest flavors but are also the most stable. So as export teas, they were also the most desirable. But because they have been manipulated more, they have more uniform and less interesting flavors. They are a bit more pedestrian. All the same, because oxidized tea is more stable and in the main was also less expensive, it became the more common tea. Green tea, because it has many more original tea flavors and degrades more in long transit, was both more desired among tea connoisseurs, but could also be a greater risk for tea shippers. So it had less of an impact in the global market. White tea in the 18th century was just about unknown outside of China. Its incredibly fragile state made it impossible to export, and realistically, the finer points of its existence wouldn't have mattered anyway. 1 sugar or 2 in your white tea? See, it just wasn't on. But what tea? Which tea? What kind of tea were the earliest European, British, and colonial tea drinkers consuming? To start with, green tea. Why exactly this was the first style of tea exported, I haven't been able to track down. But the fact that it is more perishable than oxidized teas makes me think Chinese tea vendors were willing to part more easily with the more perishable tea. However, once tea was seen as a reliable way to get silver into the country and the BEIC had proved themselves a reliable trading partner about 50 years into the tea trade, oolong and other oxidized tea became available on the commercial market. The region of its origin was anglicized and bohea or bohea tea became the desirable object. If anyone has steeped green tea for too long and too hot of water, you know that there is a particular bitter taste it can produce that is absent in oxidized teas. So this gentler, richer tea that could be re-steeped without getting so bitter was much desired in the European markets. Bohea tea and its offshoots at this point were oolong teas or a semi-black tea. They were not as fully oxidized as modern mechanically processed teas are, but for the sake of categories, I am lumping oolongs in with black teas because they have been oxidized some, and green teas are not oxidized at all. To differentiate the green tea, it was usually known as Singlo tea. Again, another sloppy anglicization of a geographical designation. And again, there were categories within categories that much was made of. The Dutch, with a longer history of tea importing and tea drinking, brought critical sipping and tea variety one-upmanship with them, as William of Orange claimed the English throne with his Queen Mary, the daughter of that hot mess, James II, and arrived to sit the British throne in 1689. In the North American colonies, beggars couldn't be choosers, so in the early 18th century, most early colonial tea was expired green tea. As markets and trade routes got sorted and North American-based shippers got into the tea game, North America got its paws on some black tea as well. But there seemed to be a divide. The northern colonies that had their own shippers and ran in circles with the Dutch and the wide world tended to have access to more oxidized teas. Southern cities, which mainly traded with England and the Caribbean, tended to have access to more green teas. In fact, as iced tea developed in the 19th century, it was initially made with exclusively green tea. Anyway, the higher up the social ladder one went, the more variety and opinions about tea one tended to have. The lower down, tea became a more generic, mixed, and adulterated product. In tea categorization, the designation sweepings was a real one, and acknowledged that one was drinking a decoction of tea dust and things. But it has caffeine and, even more importantly, does contain some tea. So one could proudly say that they were serving up a dish that contains tea. Made with tea, but maybe not made only of tea. Look, don't look too closely here. That's rude. So here in the North American British colonies in the 18th century, tea with sugar, and then as the dairy industry took hold and then ice houses were established, milk or cream were also on. Tea plain was usually drunk at breakfast, and later in the century became the province of austere cranks and tea snobs who were the type who owned 136 teapots. But in the 18th century, there was one way of drinking tea that definitely did not exist. And that was tea with lemon. It will be a while before these two exotic imports meet up in one drinking vessel. I suspect it's in the 20th century when manufactured clothing, diet culture, and grocery stores begin their entangled rise in America. So that will have to wait for later as well. Join me next week as I take a stroll in the growing American garden. While they are still largely about feeding the family, they start to become the place where the ornamental and the exotic are grown. And there is a curious trend to seek novelty from afar, instead of the galaxy of unknown American plants hovering at the edges of the tamped-down wilderness known as colonial civilization. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A rating of the podcast on your favorite listening widget makes me easier to find, and a review with actual words does even more. Along with the promised pictures and links, I also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode, when I finally get caught up. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter and Instagram bio at THOA Food and in the show description.